Good afternoon, and welcome to today's meeting on the Council on Foreign Relations. The usual injunctions about cell phones, Blackberries, wireless devices, infrared, various bionic parts that anyone may have should all be off at this juncture, or at very least on vibrate, so that you can enjoy them and we can't. This meeting is on the record, so if you have anything to say that you don't want reported, probably a good idea not to say it. And we will certainly do, as usual, a question and answer after the session. I'm Zachary Karabell of Fred Alger Management, and also the author of a recent book on Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence called Peace Be Upon You. And we are here this afternoon for a discussion of a recent book by Dr. Sari, who is currently president and professor of philosophy at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem. He's also a member of the International Advisory Board of the Council on Foreign Relations and affiliated here. He has had a long and truly distinguished and rather moving career as both a public servant, someone involved in the long, drawn-out, and certainly as yet unfinished struggle for Palestinian autonomy, independence, rights in the still as yet unresolved area of the world that has been referred to by multiple names depending on which side one tends to find oneself on. And he's the author of a memoir about his life both in Israel, abroad, and as a member and someone who's been active in the peregrinations and difficulties that these two peoples have faced over the past, certainly over the past 58 years, 59 years, and looks almost certain will face for a goodly portion in the years ahead. His memoir is Once Upon a Country, A Palestinian Life, and it really is a magnificent book written with, I think, a level of humanism and philosophical humanism that is incredibly rare in this day and age, and utterly unlooked for coming out of at least the public and external impression of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in that sense is, in its own way, a love letter to peace and to hope and to the endless potential of human beings to draw themselves out of their darkest moments and honor their most noble instincts. You know, as I was reading the book, I was struck, of course, in a deeply narcissistic fashion by the similarities between Sari Nusseibeh and myself. He went to Oxford as a young student. I went to Oxford and studied Middle East Studies as a young student. He had long, unruly hair, didn't dress appropriately at many of his classes, offended his professors, and I did much the same. He went to Harvard to get a PhD in philosophy. I went to Harvard to get a PhD in history. He returned home to East Jerusalem to take up a position at Birzeit University and also at Hebrew University at the time to teach at both places to really try to bridge cultures as an educator. I left academia to return home to the Upper West Side to become a struggling writer, also known as West Jerusalem. Sari dedicated his life to the struggles of Palestinian rights, helping to, in part, organize what wasn't fully non-violent, but certainly was not violent in the way it was depicted, or certainly later events, the first Intifada in 1988. I went to a few student demonstrations at Columbia. Sari went to jail for his role in actually trying to bring about peace. I went to work on Wall Street.
Another kind of jail.
And he wrote a book about a stirring and stunning life, and I wrote a book about Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence. So I want to begin, I guess, with something that really stuck out for me in the book, where you say, rather innocuously, and this is not the beginning of a chapter or the end of a chapter, it's actually just a line in the middle of a paragraph where you say that you have always believed and still do that Palestinians and Israelis or Jews and Arabs are natural allies. And I wondered if you could illuminate us about that and where that sentiment comes from.
Well, to the extent that I can, I shall certainly try. It's something that came to me as an idea suddenly. I hadn't thought about it when I was giving a talk at the Hebrew University just after 2000, after the outbreak of violence. And I was trying to speak to an Israeli audience and to, at the same time, develop my own thoughts on what was happening, and trying to see beyond the visible landscape, so to speak, a little bit deeper into how we can be together or can work together. And it suddenly struck me as I was just talking that that we shouldn't really be persuaded by simply looking at the surface of reality that we're looking at, that we are enemies if we're shooting at each other, that really deep down, objectively speaking, we are allies of one another. And what I meant by that was that we were natural allies, we were objective allies, because we had a shared future, the Israelis and the Palestinians. And this nobody else has shared with us. Nobody. I mean, for instance, if you are an American Jew supporting Israel, or if you're an Arab Muslim supporting the Palestinians, and you're living either in the United States or wherever, you do not have as much between you and the Israeli, or as much between you and the Palestinian, as the Israeli and the Palestinian have with each other, because we live at each other's doorsteps, and we share the same present, and we share the same future. And it is therefore objectively the case that, rationally speaking, we should be working with each other together in order to create the space that will take us in the future. Now, so that's what I meant by saying we were natural or objective allies. It didn't sound very convincing to a lot of people at the time. I suppose until today I still have to explain it more deeply to myself what I meant. But that's often what happens with me. Something just comes out of my mouth, and I spend months, years maybe, afterwards trying to explain it, even to myself.
You write a lot in the book and apply a lot of your philosophical studies. I mean, this may be the only book that will ever be written about this struggle where there is at least as much discussion of Kant and Heidegger and Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi and the existentialism of freedom as opposed to the actuality of freedom. And I wondered how you juxtapose that perspective, the philosophical one. You write multiple times in the book about freedom really is ultimately a state of consciousness and an act of will, not something that exists tangibly out there politically. I suppose, and I don't actually mean this in a cheeky fashion, but if that's the case, then what's the struggle about?
Well, let me just, I'm sorry, you lost me in the last sentence, but you set me off thinking, and just to do justice to the field of, to the philosophers who've been interested in this, I want to mention somebody by the name of Thomas Capitan, a philosopher who teaches here in the United States, and he edited what I would consider to my mind as being the first philosophical book on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that came out maybe 10, 15 years ago. Not a very well-known book. But I have a chapter in it, so you can go back and read that book and buy it. But let me tell you something. I went back to teach in 1978, and I was happy just doing my own work, when I suddenly found myself, by force of circumstance, not by planning, the head of the faculty union at Birzeit University where I was teaching. Now, so I suddenly found myself, colleagues came to me and said, look, you have to do this. So I found myself in that position, and shortly afterwards, I found myself as the head of the union in conflict with the Israeli occupying power. I hadn't planned to be placed in that position, but that's where I found myself. When the Israelis passed a military order at the time, I remember it because, of course, it's very much part of my life. I remember the number. It's called Military Order 854. And as you know, the military authorities were issuing one order after the other after 1967 to basically administer their occupation of the Palestinians. Now, this was one just such order, and that particular order related to the operation of universities and higher education in the occupied territories. And it basically gave the Israeli authorities powers to control and to determine what was going on within those universities. Like, for example, who was to be accepted as professor, students, books, contents of materials. And, you know, frankly, it shocked me. And therefore, I found myself right there and then, as the head of the faculty union, standing up against the occupying power on the ground only at the time of academic freedom. And then one thing led to another. So before I knew it, I was talking about political freedom, I was talking about independence, I was talking about religious freedom, I was talking about all kinds of freedoms. And actually, I ended up even developing a course at the university on freedom. And that came in the late 70s, early 80s. And so it was a kind of, you know, I was just pushed slowly into the political environment, simply through just disliking, finding unacceptable issues which I think anybody in my position, not a Palestinian, but anybody with a conscience would have found unacceptable. And I found myself simply resisting those things and fighting them until I ended up in jail, as you say.
On this question of freedom, most of the works that you talk about and cite about truly the existential state of freedom. You know, freedom is something one has to first feel and experience. Again, coming out of Al-Farabi or Ibn Sina or the Western traditions. What is the role, or in what way does violence or opposition to a state of the absence of freedom, is that ever something that can be philosophically justified, and how?
Okay, so that's a very difficult question. Let me go back a little bit, and then I'll come back to answering this question. Let me go back to the initial question concerning my remarks on what I consider to be, what I understand to be freedom in the context of a subjective state of affairs. I'm referring, when I say that, specifically to the instances of being in jail, and I'm relating to a lot of students, students at the university, and colleagues of mine that have gone through the experience of being in jail. And I should tell you that, you know, we as a population of about 3 million people have in fact had more than perhaps 500,000 instances of arrest. So you can imagine the percentage in each family. Out of every, you know, few people, you had one person at least going through jail. Now, very often you go to jail, you're interrogated, the other side wishes to get information from you. That's what jail is all about. That's what interrogation is all about. You go, you are interrogated in order for the other side to get information from you. And there, in the context of interrogation, inside the cell, you have on the one hand the prisoner, and you have on the other hand the interrogator. Now, very often people forget that the interrogator, insofar as they are interrogating the prisoner, are in fact themselves anyway sitting in that cell. People often forget that. But the interrogator is actually not sitting in a nice office in Wall Street. They're not sitting in a nice place. They're sitting inside the cell with the prisoner. And what is the interrogator trying to do in that horrible situation? The interrogator is trying basically to break the will of the prisoner, to somehow find a way to get the prisoner to provide him with information. And it's therefore a contest of wills. On the one hand, the interrogator trying various ways and means, including the use of physical or psychological pressure, to break the will of the prisoner, to get information out of them. And on the other hand, you have the prisoner who realizes this, or may realize this, and therefore refuses to allow their will to be broken. And, you know, the will can be broken sometimes through, or the attempt to break the will can sometimes happen through offering the prisoner a cigarette, if they are smokers, of course, and are pining to have a cigarette. So just offering them a cigarette, making them a little bit more lenient, is one way of doing this. Now, if the prisoner is properly conscious of the situation, if the prisoner is properly conscious of what is taking place inside the cell, and therefore refuses to allow their will to be broken, in the final analysis at the end of the day, what you have is a situation in which the interrogator has in fact lost. He did not manage to break the will of the prisoner. The prisoner managed to in fact control what the interrogator's abilities or capacities are, or how they are defined. So this is a kind of contest of wills. And to the extent the prisoner is able to assert their own will, insofar as that is the case, they are also able to assert their own identity, their own sense of who they are as individuals or as a nation. And in fact, therefore, they exhibit the very first signs of what freedom is all about, because they have been able to be free themselves from within of all the needs or desires that a human person might have inside those circumstances. And the idea is that if you can do this within yourself, if you become a master of your own desires and will and needs and concerns, then you can translate this into the surrounding, objective surroundings. So this is the whole idea of the, and this actually I got not by reading books. This I got simply by talking to students and learning from them, the students I was supposed to be teaching. I got most of of my understanding of what the situation was about through talking to them. Now, to go to your second part of the question, namely, are you ever morally justified, if I may put it this way, to in fact resist the situation of being deprived of your basic rights, including freedom, through the use of violence? Now, luckily, I've never, in fact, personally, have had the need to be placed in a situation where, to me, violence was a necessity. I've always been in situations where I have found that, in fact, not only there's an alternative to violence in resisting circumstances of deprivation, not only are alternatives to violence, but that also that actually non-violence is far better as a functioning effort than violence, and that violence is very often, in fact, counterproductive. Now, I wouldn't claim, although, you know, I'm in philosophy, I wouldn't claim to have a theory about the world and how the world operates, but I claim as a Palestinian to I claim to be able to say that within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, A, non-violence is better than violence, and B, violence is actually counterproductive. And this is not only true, I think, for us, the Palestinians, it's equally true also for the Israelis. Because in the context of the Israelis and the Palestinian conflict, neither side can use force to break the will of the other. The only way that we can, in fact, reach peace is by understanding each other, by realizing the situation of mutuality that we exist in, and by working together to build a future, a joint future.
You know, taking from that and going a bit from the philosophical to the real.
I'm sure your audience is fed up with philosophy.
No, maybe it's just a rare moment
okay.
here. The 1990s, I think, struck many of us on the outside as a moment where nonviolence and the potential to move toward a shared future seemed possible, particularly in the wake of Madrid and Oslo, which you write about quite a bit. And you talk about the celebrations, certainly amongst you, and given what you had been articulating in the 1980s and 1990s. At one point, you wrote a letter right before the first Intifada saying Israel either should annex the West Bank and, you know, restore rights to the Palestinians, or there should be some sort of dual solution. And the euphoria of Oslo as a potential move in that direction, and even with some of the ambivalence about the Declaration of Principles. 2020 hindsight is obviously easy and much more clear, but what happened between 1994 and Camp David such that that which seemed so promising and seemed to be playing a very familiar script of a difficult, egregious conflict slowly resolving itself through acts of diplomacy and a shared sense of future, going that off the rails?
Well, let me just say something, in a sense, disagreeing with your portrayal of what's happening, in a sense. It is true that it looks like the whole thing has collapsed between 94 and now. It looks like everything has collapsed, in a sense. But in another sense, if you take a step back and you look at the overall pattern of history that's evolving or unfolding, in a sense, I think we're still there. In another sense, that's to say, we're still there. There's been a sea change back in the early 90s. I believe that the attitudes of the psychological and the attitudes of both sides have undergone a major transformation towards realizing that the only way towards the future is through a solution, a mutually acceptable solution. And I think this did not exist prior to the 90s. It exists today, although what exists at the same time today is the sense of total frustration at being able to reach that solution. Now, what happened? A lot of things happened. I very often in my mind liken the Oslo peace process to a child that was born of two parents, father and mother, and that the child that was born of the two parents was a responsibility of the two parents. It was not the responsibility of one person alone. You know, very often you can say, if something goes wrong with something, that you can blame the one person or the other for things going wrong with that thing. But in the case of a child, if you do not look after it, if you do not protect it, whether you are father or you are mother, then you are responsible. And you cannot come up afterwards and say, it wasn't my fault that the child has died. It is his mother's fault, or it is the father's fault. It is your fault as well as a parent. And I think with Oslo, the Oslo process was born as a child. And unfortunately, both parents did not treat it, that child, with the care that they should have treated it with. They did not, I think, realize or understand the miraculous birth of this thing, which was Oslo. Of course, not everybody liked Oslo at the time. Everybody, saw one defect or the other. But again, it was a child. It wasn't a perfect human being that came into the world. It was a child that needed care, that needed protection, that needed growth, that needed sustenance, and both sides did not look after it very well. On the Palestinian side, our problem was, A, that we did not internally provide our people with the system, with the structure that our people were hoping to live by or under as a result of a peace agreement with Israel. We wanted freedom, we wanted dignity, we wanted respect, we wanted to be equal under the law, we wanted a clean government, we wanted efficiency, we wanted parks, we wanted, healthcare units, we wanted this, we wanted that, and we did not get it. We got financial sharks, we got corruption, we got money that was wasted, we got people who were searching for power, we got all those things. We did not get what we dreamt for. And certainly, if you went afterwards and looked at the situation, it's not at all what corresponded with the dream that we had before in the 80s and the 70s as we worked in order to bring about independence. And not only failure on that front, there was also failure on the negotiation front. In other words, we did not also proceed as we had hoped we would proceed after the signing of Oslo, step after step towards a final resolution of the peace agreement with an independent Palestinian state in the territories that we hoped and we still hope we'd be able to create an independent state on. So failure on both fronts led to the frustration, I think, that resulted eventually in the backlash against Fatah and the old leadership.
If I can push back a little and maybe take your analogy, if Oslo was a child born of two parents in 1994, the child would be about 13 years old right now. Teenagers are not known for their rational, cool-headed ability to deal with difficult circumstances. It usually is sort of a rocky period sometime ahead, followed by distancing and reconciliation. So I would assume by your timetable that sometime around 2025, we will have a 30-year-old child ready to reconcile with the past. I mean, what is the pathway from now? You just said that we are actually still there, meaning that it may seem as if this entire thing has crumbled, but it's part of an ongoing process.
You know, I'm not good with images. I'll try to use one, and excuse me for not being good at describing this the way I think reflects what I think. The layer dividing, if you think of it as a layer, dividing the present from a potential positive future is an extremely thin layer. It's a thin layer in the sense that you can knock through it at any point in time, whether today or tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or after 5 years, and you will be there. It's like what they call a worm in space. And you'll be there in that future. So it's not a question of things being laid out that you can only get things done if matters ripen, for example, like organic fruits or organic things ripen only after a certain time. The future is actually possible now. And the only thing that divides the future, the positive future from now, I believe, is us, is our will, is our act as a human being, as human beings. And I think today it is possible, not tomorrow and not after 5 years. Today it is possible to bring about the peace that both sides would accept. It just requires, a major effort. It requires action that's not traditional. It requires us to have faith in the fact that we can do this.
You write quite a bit about, certainly in light of Hamas, an alternate vision of Islam, an Islam that is embracing of reason as well as faith, of logic to an outcome that is conducive to freedom, whether it's freedom of expression or political freedoms. But you also write, somewhat sadly, of the reaction in the past 5 or 6 years, the rise of Hamas within the electoral system in the Palestinian territories, and the degree of ratcheting up of mutual animosity and anti-Semitism amongst the Palestinians, a sort of an anti-Arab, I guess, mirrored anti-Semitism amongst the Israelis. And while I totally agree that culture has a way of shifting on a dime unexpectedly, one day the Berlin Wall is up and who knows when communism is going to end, and the next day it's not. And only in retrospect can one see the seeds of that, but at the time it can seem highly unlikely until, as you say, it breaks through. But do you see currently within the dialogue and the discussion, even with the building of the wall, and you write about a small victory at Al-Quds, of the wall was going to go through the soccer fields of Al-Quds, and getting the wall to be moved such that it didn't totally divide the university or prevent that from being played, which is a victory of sorts, but a symbolic one as much as anything else, because the fence then goes elsewhere. So where are those seeds today, or do you see them in practice?
Well, let me say what I consider that to have been a victory of, that the sort of moving of the wall from one place to another. I think it was a victory for common sense, a victory for non-violence, a victory for the hope that things can actually work out. Now, why? Because of the following. Now, all of you, that the wall was being built. It's being built. In many places, in fact, the path of the wall couldn't be changed. And what made it different in our case, in the case of our campus, was the following. First of all, that we tried to act before the wall was actually built. We did not wait until the wall was built in order to go and then make protests. We saw what was happening in advance of it happening. And then we wanted to protest. And I remember talking to the students. And our students, come from different backgrounds. So some of them are pro-Hamas, some of them are pro-Fatah, some of them are pro-communists. You name it, someone is for it in our campus. Everybody is there. And on the first day, the students wanted to come and protest the wall. And what they wanted to do was to go and protest it in the way or the manner in which they were used to do it. That's to say, by using some kind of violence. For example, by throwing rocks at the soldiers in front of them. And we sat and talked to the students. And we said to the students, very simply, that, okay, you can go and throw a rock at a soldier, but then the soldier will probably shoot back at you, and then one of you will be killed. And yes, great thing, the following day there will be headlines in the newspaper that there's a martyr at this campus, and the picture of one of you will appear on the front page. But then what will happen is that the army will come and shut down the university, and then the third day after that, the Israelis will continue to build the wall. So what do we get out of this? And they immediately saw sense. And I'm talking about students from all backgrounds. So they all accepted that we shouldn't resort to the use of violence. And there was a major march that we started from within the campus. And we all went together down to the main football field, soccer field, where this was going to happen, where the wall was going to come. And there, of course, the bulldozers were beginning to be moving around and so on. And there were several Israeli soldiers with guns standing there ready for a major confrontation. And then, as we all walked into the football field, and when I say we, I mean we, including the president of the university, and the professors, and the students. But as we walked non-violently into the middle of the football field, where the soldiers were all ready and nervous and looking about to shoot, by prior agreement, we had our sports team run into the football field wearing their sports clothes and starting to have exercises between the soldiers and the marchers. And you could see, and I could see, I was looking at the faces of the soldiers, the minute the people with their sports clothes ran into the field, the soldiers suddenly felt relaxed. Before they were tense, they were worried. Suddenly they felt relaxed, and they started moving backwards because they realized this wasn't going to be a confrontation. And so they moved back. We moved in. We set up camp there for about 22 days. Each day we had some kind of activity. We held our examinations there. We held our classes there. We held various public relations campaigns there to tell the world about the wall. And finally, Condoleezza Rice got interested. And Condoleezza Rice picked up the telephone, called the director of the Israeli Ministry of Defense, and said, look, what are you doing to these guys? Why are you building a wall right in the middle of their campus? And the director of the ministry then said, okay, I'm sorry, we need to build the wall, but what can we do? And she told him, you have to go back to Jerusalem and not come out of a meeting with the university people until you have actually reached agreement with them. And so, one day there's a meeting being arranged. Sorry if I'm taking long, but it's interesting, I think. One day we had a meeting arranged with the people from the Ministry of Defense and people from the university. It was at a hotel. People from the Ministry of Defense had come, about 3 or 4 lawyers, about 3 or 4 engineers with lots of maps, in there with them. Then the people from the university were there with lots of engineers and maps and lawyers, and they had all come, about 20 people meeting in that room. By the way, the Consul General of the United States also came and said that I'm not going to go in and share the meeting, I'm going to sit outside. Then the minister, the director of the ministry came in and told me before the meeting, Sari, let's go into the next room. We did. He told me, I'll be honest with you and frank. I just came back from Washington, and Condoleezza Rice asked me not to leave this room until we have worked out an agreement on where the wall was going to be. So where do you want it to be? I told him like that. He said, fine. He came back into the room with the lawyers and mappers and said, that's how it will be. And what finished, end of the, so no shooting, no killing, no bloodshed, and the perfect ending for something that was on the Palestinian side shared in by people from all sorts of backgrounds, including Hamas students and popular struggle students and I don't know what students, everybody, because that made sense. So what I am saying in a nutshell is this, that beyond names, Hamas, Fatah, Popular Front, there are people, there are minds, there are human beings. And it is the human beings that are important. And I think if you address human beings, whoever they may be, in the right way, you get results. If you do not address them in the right way, if you do not see them as human beings, if you refuse to see them except as Muslims, Jews, Christians, women, men, children, whatever, then you can't get results.
I have one more question, and then I want to turn it over to everyone else. It's interesting in your book that while you do talk about times when the United States was present as a central actor, that in many ways the United States is very much peripheral to this story as a lived experience. And I think that's important and to some degree refreshing, and that certainly, like any culture, we tend to place ourselves as the utterly central actors in any drama that we are proximate to. But what is, in your mind, the role of the United States going forward? Is there the potential for it to remain, well, I suppose, to remain destructive or become constructive? Or is it, in fact, necessary and appropriate longer term for that role to be more the one you described of the U.S. consul, of sitting on the sidelines, present but not driving the discussion?
Well, I think, circumstances vary, and therefore what the United States can do, or it is appropriate for it to do, change from period to period and from context to context. So, for instance, 5 years ago, I came here with Ami Ayalon, with whom I had initiated a declaration of principles for a peace agreement. And we were working to get this petition to be signed by as many people as possible. And both of us at the time believed that the only party that can actually make a difference is not the United States, but the people themselves, the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves. The people, not the leaders, the people. They can get together and push. Now, I think that was true at the time. Now, today, I think the situation is different. And I believe today it is absolutely necessary for the United States to lead an international effort to try and bring about a solution. I think today it is impossible for the people of the region by themselves to get things done, unfortunately. They're not in a position to do it. But I believe that the readiness is there. The readiness is there on the part of the Israelis, and the readiness is there on the part of the Palestinians, in spite of the appearances to the contrary, in spite of what you look at and see today, namely the shooting and the hatred and everything like that, and the aggression. I think deep down, both sides are ready, and I think the United States can lead an international effort, but it has to lead it in an extraordinary way, not in an ordinary, traditional way. I think, sometimes you need untraditional methods to try and untangle or disentangle something that looks totally, unsolvable or insoluble. So I think the United States can do it. I suggested earlier today that one thing the United States can do is get onto a plane, charter an airplane, get perhaps the president or the foreign secretary, or both preferably, and as many people in that airplane as are required, and perhaps through Europe pick up people representing the quartet, and then go by the Arab countries and pick up a few Arab leaders, maybe the king of Saudi Arabia, the president of Egypt, the king of Jordan, the leader Abu Mazen of the Palestinians, people like that, and land in Tel Aviv and go and camp at one of the hotels there in Jerusalem. Maybe King David, maybe the American colony, and then issue a statement. We are here, we, the United States, the quartet, the Arab governments are here, and Mr. Ulmert, please come to the table. We want you to make peace with the other side. We are not leaving until you sign an agreement. If the United States were to charter such a plane tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, we will have peace, I think.
Well, I hope you get a seat on that plane.
Well, I'll be waiting in the airport.
Okay. Questions, please. And please identify yourself, and there are microphones. Sir?
Maurice Templesman, Leon Templesman and Son. I joined the tribute to your humanism and your approach. Let me shift to implementation. One of the critical elements for a state or an aspirant state is the capacity and the will to deliver once an arrangement is negotiated. Since we're talking about a particular situation, an incident that Prime Minister Ben-Gurion faced in the early days when he had to clobber the Irgun, say there's only one army here. There are not two armies. How do you see, first, two questions. Is it a matter of will or is it a matter of ability? And how do you see that element being brought into the picture once a deal is made?
You know, I know what you're saying. The answer to your question, whether it's a question of will or a question of ability in the case of our own leadership, is that it's a question of will, mostly, or most of the time, and sometimes of ability, like recently. And clearly, the Palestinian leadership, by the way, not unlike other leaderships, unfortunately, have never forsaken the belief in the fact that you need a stick, that violence might work, even though, you know, it may not be enough, and that you need an olive branch, but you also need a stick. And unfortunately, this is a belief shared by a lot of political leaders across the political spectrum. And it's certainly something that's also believed, unfortunately, by a lot of Palestinian leaders. I happen to disagree for different reasons. But, you know, I think in the company of my wife, probably here, sitting here, probably are in a minority in that sort of respect. That, and me, by the way, just influenced in this regard by her, probably are in a minority in this respect, because on the whole, people believe that, you know, the two work together. I believe the one actually destroys the other, and that nonviolence is the best means or method to go forward. And that's why I've argued, if I may just add, that, for example, in my own case, I'd put it a condition for the establishment of a Palestinian state, a Palestinian condition, for the Palestinian state to be totally, absolutely demilitarized, because I believe any kind of military weapons in a Palestinian state can only be self-destructive, cannot be useful, and the money spent on it can be better spent on other things that are useful for a Palestinian state.
Sir?
My name is David Phillips with the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity. Welcome, Dr. Sari.
Thank you, David.
On a number of occasions, you talked about the importance of human interaction. And clearly, after Oslo, there was a proliferation of people-to-people activities and civil society initiatives involving Israelis and Palestinians. That has all but stopped after the Al-Aqsa Intifada. To what extent has the absence of civil society endeavor hardened attitudes on either the Palestinian or the Israeli side?
Well, I want to say first, in reaction to the person who asked the question, if not to the question itself, that, you know, I would also welcome people who are Nobel laureates to be on that plane going to that area. But to go back to your question, I think that the people's attitudes hardened as a result of the failure in the peace talks, as opposed to the peace talks having failed as a result of the hardening of people's positions. It is the result of the failure of the peace talks that have hardened once again people's positions. But talking about the people-to-people program in particular, I think we have a lot to learn from as to why, in fact, on the whole, a lot of money was spent there, seemed to be of no use or of little use. It doesn't mean that the people-to-people program in general or the idea in general was wrong, but I think there is a lot for us to learn about in why it did not manage that investment to maintain cooperation and good feelings between the two sides. And I believe one of the things, for instance, that can be pointed out very quickly, I mean, just an example, that where the exercise of bringing people together was more a question of limelight, of PR, of glamour, passing for a passing instance. It just didn't work. So where, for instance, you put money into bringing a Palestinian group of children with an Israeli group of children, you took them to I don't know where, you set them up in a nice hotel with a swimming pool and for 2 days only, and with lots of people, lots of money being spent on facilitators talking about I don't know what, and showed them 1 or 2 films and everybody was happy. Then they did some shopping and went back to their respective towns. I think that was money that was wasted. Where, on the other hand, you created efforts where things were cumulatively developed year after year, month after month. Things have worked. And, I saw somebody, for instance, representing the Seeds of Peace program here. Can't remember where, but there. And the Seeds of Peace program, for instance, is one example, in my opinion, where, in fact, exactly what is successful, and a model of what is possibly successful, should be copied. And there are thousands of models of failure that should be looked at and avoided in the future. So I'll go back to saying very simply, people-to-people programs should be invested in, should be supported. However, the mistakes from the past should be learned from. Successful models should be adopted. Failed models should be avoided. But one should never lose hope, even though a lot of money was wasted in the past. Jacob?
Jacob Weisberg from Slate Magazine. Is there any way, do you think, for the United States to successfully promote the growth of democracy in the Arab world? And in that vein, was it a mistake for Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration to encourage the Palestinian election that led to the victory by Hamas?
Well, I don't want to be drawn into an internal American debate, but let me say this. Democracy, first of all, in my opinion, is not something, with all my respect to the United States, that one country like the United States can teach other countries, or one person can teach another person. I think there are sufficient, you might find this very strange coming from me to say, but I believe there are sufficient values of common concern to human beings wherever they are and wherever they may come from. Values that actually constitute the foundation of what democracy means, that are believed in, that are held as values in different cultures. Democracy is not simply, what I mean to say is this, that democracy is not simply an election process for this party or that for a parliament. As you probably know, this only constitutes the tip of an iceberg. And the iceberg is a collection a whole community of values, how you treat other people, how you treat what's gender-like, equality, respect for the elderly, for the young, free exchange of opinion, how the family is instituted, what the relations are, and so on and so forth. Now, I think, in my own humble opinion, that in the Arab world, there are sufficient grounds and seeds for the growth of democracy from the bottom up. And I don't think we need to be taught by anyone what democracy is. I think we can teach ourselves what democracy is. And where we find there are forces within our societies that stand against democracies, then I think it is our own challenge and our own responsibility within those societies to fight against those forces. And since I believe in a pattern of history that unfolds always in the positive direction, I believe, therefore, that if such forces were to stand in the face of the democratic pattern of evolution in the Arab countries, I think such forces can be defeated internally. That's what I think.
Here, and then we'll go there. Gary?
Yes, Gary Rosen from Commentary Magazine. You are an inspiring figure. The stories you tell about resolving this conflict over the football field at Al-Quds inspiring as well. I think if your approach had been embraced more generally by Palestinians, an approach of civil disobedience, of peaceful resistance, it would have met with a great deal of support on the Israeli side. So my question is, why do you not have a bigger following? Why is Sari Nusseibeh not the Gandhi of the Palestinians?
Several things. First of all, I think in general, as I was answering in my answer earlier, unfortunately, in general, the majority of people believe in the use and value and efficacy of violence. And it seems to be a natural kind of accompaniment to other beliefs that people have, whether they are in positions of power or if they are in positions like, for instance, at home under occupation. So we're not, it is true that that not many people share my thoughts or feelings. But then, the same is, I would say the same if I were looking at other societies, not only at Palestinian societies. I'd say, in looking at other societies also, that people don't share necessarily my thoughts and feelings. But nonetheless, within the Palestinian community, there are examples, and I'll give you an example. Very strange example. Of the various factions constituting the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, there's been always, not always, but for a long time, a party called, what was called at one point, the Communist Party. What distinguished the Communist Party from other parties constituting the PLO were two things. One thing was that right from the beginning, from its inception, with the birth of Israel, there was the readiness to recognize Israel, and in fact a call for a two-state solution, and that distinguished the Communist Party within the context of the PLO from the other factions in the PLO. But the other very significant element that distinguished the Communist Party was the fact that it actually believed in nonviolence, or believed, or did not believe, put it this way, not believed in nonviolence, but did not believe in the use of violence in the Israeli-Palestinian context. So they were against the use of violence. So that was a component within the Palestinian community. And, it never became a majority. I never myself had anything to do as such with the Communist Party. But, there are examples like that, some NGOs. Another example, you may be surprised, where nonviolence was internalized was within jails, Israeli jails. And, this is going back to what I was talking about earlier, where for several reasons, people who went inside the Israeli jails and then had to undergo a new struggle in order to attain various privileges and rights. For example, access to bits of soap, or more time for exercises per day, or access to radio or to newspaper or to, all these things were things that the prisoners inside Israeli jails had to struggle in order to achieve. But they couldn't, of course, wage a military struggle against the prison authorities. So they had to organize themselves inside the jails in non-violent ways, including strikes and so on and so forth. And so if you look at the Palestinian society in different stages and phases, you will find that actually a lot of Palestinians have resorted to the use of nonviolence in different periods of their history, in different parts. But, what's more important is this, that unfortunately we have not yet reached, and I don't think we will ever reach, in Palestine or elsewhere, the point where people will truly recognize that power, military power, or the use of force is a totally useless tool or means to bring about positive change. It is good to bring destructive change. It is good to bring destruction. But I think it's not yet, we're not yet at the point to discover, to realize that actually it does not bring about positive change. And I wish the Palestinians would have, let me tell you a story. Balfour Declaration in 1917, when the Lord Balfour, said that, gave this promise, I think, it would have made sense for my grandfather in his turban and his robes to gather around all the sheikhs of Palestine at the time, to charter a plane, to come to London, to knock on the 10 Downing Street, and to tell Lord Balfour, Mr. Balfour, you've just given a fantastic promise to the Jewish people, to promise them a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and we think you're brilliant, but, we want to sit together with you and decide together, where's our place in this, and to reach agreement. Instead of which, my grandfather and the chieftains and the sheikhs went out in demonstrations and started, just expressing their anger and frustration. But the truth is that it would have been much better, it would have made much more sense not to have used violence right from the beginning, from the time of Lord Balfour's declaration. We would have been far better off, both sides.
We have time for one very brief question and answer, and this gentleman had, so.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Nusseibeh, my name is Roland Paul. I'm a lawyer. You mentioned the wall, which the Israelis, of course, maybe correctly called the fence. Don't you think it's, however, a reasonable response by the Israelis to build that wall in light of the lives that it has saved?
Well, quickly, I think that the only problem I have with the wall is this, that I wish the wall were created or built by mutual agreement between the two sides, that it was built on the 67 line, as far as that is possible, and where that wasn't possible, then by agreement of the two sides where it should be built. This is my only objection to the wall, in addition to the general moral objection or general human objection of, I wish life was better and that we could in fact live without a war. But I think, I agree with you that the suicide attacks that have been perpetrated by Palestinians have been devastating to the process, devastating to our image, devastating to my belief in my own tradition, in my own religion, in my own background. And, there's no way that, and it sort of allowed, therefore, Israel, yes, absolutely, to do that. But I think the wall should be built somewhere else, in general.
So Dr. Nusseibeh, a humanist, a scholar, a philosopher, thank you very much today. We will be having a book signing right outside at the end, so please come by. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that.